Hello, good evening, and welcome to everyone who's joining us for this talk with an expert. I'm Jane Arthur, and I'm been a member of the Art Society Worcester for the last 2 years, having moved to Worcester in 2018. And I'm really pleased this evening to introduce a very good friend of mine, long term colleague, Jenni Waugh, who's going to talk to us about Gertrude Jekyll. So, hi, Jenni.
Hello, Jane.
Um, so, Gertrude Jekyll is largely known for her gardens these days, but was she always a gardener?
Well, no, she was. She didn't really start out as one. I mean, I think a lot of people, when they think of Gertrude Jekyll, they think of this lady, of an older, tall, plump lady. She was a big girl. She was 5'7", and had size 8 feet. We know that because her boots are in Guildford Museum. And she was very much present in a garden. You couldn't get round her, but she didn't always look like that, and she wasn't always in a garden. She was born in London in Mayfair in 1843, and her family, her father was a bit of a gentleman engineer. He liked to tinker in the shed. He was oh gosh, I've completely forgotten what he did now, but he was very he had various sort of civil service type roles, and they had an independent income, and he encouraged her to make things with him and to problem solve. And she was sent away to school, which is quite unusual for a girl of that generation. But according to Sally Festing in the biography of her, there was an incident and homeschooling was then recommended. So I don't know what Gertie did at school, but she was the fifth of seven children. She had several brothers and two lovely sisters, and she was brought up at home. And she, as I say, she was taught craft skills, embroidery, and to sing. She had a very good singing voice, but she was encouraged to make, and she had her own shed in the garden at Bramley Hall when they moved to Surrey when she was 5. And as she grew up, she had her own shed, and she liked her own time. And so she would put cinders on the path outside the shed because she knew her dad didn't like to stand on those because they squeaked and scrunched. So she was from a very early age, she was very self-determined. And I always think of her as this sort of self-fashioned woman, that she had a privileged upbringing. They weren't top-notch county set, but they were good and middling. And she took her own path. And that path, when she was about 18, here she is, bless her, when she's about 18. And you can see she hasn't got the glasses there, but she is a bit myopic. She was always large, and she was always very conscious of that. And so throughout her life, she would go on spa treatments and things and try to feel better about herself. But she was never going to be a beauty. But she did love a fabric. She's quite stylish. And she does love a nice dress and a nice skirt. And she went to study at the South Kensington School of Art in 1861. She was a huge fan of Ruskin. He was at his height then, as you can imagine, the very early years of that sort of handover into the arts and crafts movement. And she even, as a child, went to see Turner's workshops. So she's very deep, she's very deep into that circle. She knew Morris, she knew Leighton, she met De Morgan. She was at this time in her life, she was very sociable. She went all over Europe, and she painted. And I just want to show you some of her paintings because people don't really know them. I'm going to share a screen with you at this point. Bear with. And I'll put the slides. Here we go, a little slideshow. So she traveled, she painted at home. Oh, come on, there we go. Oh, go right back to the top. Sorry, everybody, going to the top. So you can see these are really early pieces of work that were done when she was in her mid-20s, and she was a cat lady. So she painted, this is Thomas as Puss in Boots is the title, and it's in Godalming Museum. And this gentleman here is a gentleman called Bobrick, who lived in Bramley Village in a one up, one down house. And I'm mentioning him for a couple of reasons. One is just sort of, this is her trying to do the genteel type of art. And it's good, it's competent, but it's just not very exciting. However, Bobrick was a local resident that she knew, as a labourer. And she later describes him in 1904 in her book Old West Surrey. She describes a gentleman with a patch and a blue bandana who lived in this tiny hovel-like house at the end of Bramley High Street, a one up, one down, and she photographs that house. And that description, when we were given this unattributed bunch, but two albums of watercolors, we were able to identify him and attribute these works of art to her, because that was the gateway point. I should say I catalogued these, so I've held these in my hand, and they are really quite extraordinary. So these are the early works, but they get, hang on, there we go. This is her painting her area where she lived. Please ignore that fact that it says Algiers under this lane. This is actually a lane. And if I just move, there we go, you can see the roots, you can see her interest in the landscape, in the way the plants interact with the ground, the land's a hard landscaping. And I think although at this point in the 1860s and 70s, she's not yet gardening, she's looking to see how plants work. So here we go, I'll get rid of that over there again. This is Venice. So in the 1860s, she went to Venice, following in the steps of Ruskin, of course. But again, you can see how the paint work, the interest in how the plants and the walls interact. Later, when did she go to Algiers? She went in 1873. And I think this was a real watershed in how she started to look at colour and how she started to look at the way plants and the landscape interacted. She was staying with Barbara Bodichon, who was a fantastic woman, an early feminist, later co-founder of women's colleges and proponent of women's education and early suffrage movement. And also with an artist called Hubert Brabazon, who was named as apparently Britain's first impressionist, which sounds quite dramatic, but actually as you start to look at, I don't know if, I didn't put it in, but there's the most amazing set of paintings that she's done of a graveyard in Algiers, where you can really see that fuzzy, she's going for the impression of the view, not the detail. She's using the color to tell the story. And some people argued, oh, it's because her eyesight was terrible. Well, yeah, maybe. But I think also it was because what was increasingly striking her was the way in which you can use drifts of colour to create an ambience, to create a setting. And that's what you go on and see in her gardens. You can also see how she's using it, her art increasingly as a craftswoman. She is very interested in flower arrangement, in making metalworking. She did a lot of repoussé, she did a lot of embroidery, and later as she begins to publish books, she designs every element of the book. So this is the spine design for Old West Surrey, which is, if you've got the old Longmans, the 1904 copy, it's a green cloth binding with gold stamping here on the spine and on the cover, with these beautiful designs of the hops that she saw growing. Beautiful. And of course the embroidery, she would take commission. She actually made curtains for the Duke of Westminster, embroidered them. I think increasingly she would do the designing and other people would do the sewing. But the banner on the right is the suffragette banner that she created in 1913 for the Godalming branch of the WSPU, so that they could march on the great pilgrimage up to London. And she was friends with quite a few forward-thinking women around Surrey who were involved in the movement. I don't know if she herself was a member, but she certainly grew plants for a plant sale that was held in Guildford to raise money for the march. So she was quite involved. So by the time she's you know, she's not even 40. And I've got this wonderful description of her by George Leslie, who's a Royal Academician. And he says, she's a lady of such regular and remarkable accomplishments. She's clever and witty in conversation, active and energetic in mind and body, and possessed of artistic talents of no common order. The variety of her accomplishments includes carving, modelling, house painting, carpentry, smith's work, repoussé work, gilding, wood inlaying, embroidery, gardening, and all manner of herb and flower knowledge and culture. So, you know, she's exhausting. She's quite amazing. So yeah, I'm going to unshare for a moment. Oh no, I'm going to show you one last thing, because as I said, she was a cat lady, very much. She had many pussycats, and she would draw little cartoons of them. So you've got some architectural drawings of pussycats. She would photograph them. So in her lovely book, Home and Garden, which she wrote in 1900, which describes Munstead Wood Garden and her residence, there's quite a lot of pictures of cats in that as well. Yeah, bless her.
So how did she meet up with Lutyens then and make her home at Munstead Wood? Where was she at that point in her life?
Well, she's living, so she lived in Surrey for most of her life, apart from brief period of living in London while she was studying, and a brief period where the family lived in Wargrave in Berkshire. And the family in 1878 moved to Munstead House, which is not the most beautiful dwelling, I have to say. It's a bit of it looks a bit sort of like a grim Scottish castle, which is odd in Surrey, where you've got this beautiful warm sandstone and so on. And that was where she began to plant her own gardens, and she began to experiment with colour. And as I say, I forgot to mention, she was a great plant collector. So when she'd go on these trips to Algiers and Aleppo and Italy and so on, she would scramble up mountains and hoik plants out and bring, I mean, there's these wonderful cartoons of her sort of dangling from the tip of a mountain with a little trowel, picking up a plant. And so she began to want to do something with them properly. So that's where she started. And so in the 1880s, she's still living in the family home. Her elder brother is now the man of the house because her father had died. This is Herbert Jekyll, whose wife Agnes was a great socialite. Herbert was an MP, and Agnes would hold great house parties for him, which Gertie, I think, hated, because she, by this point, was feeling she was more antisocial and more inclined to want her own time. So she wanted her own space. And just over the road from Munstead House is the area, this triangular patch of land, which is now where Munstead Wood and Garden are. And so she, I think, acquired it or was given it. I can't remember whether it was in the family to start with. And she started to lay it out. But she wanted to build her own house. And she had very specific ideas about what she wanted. And this is where little Lutyens comes in. She, at this point, is about 46. He's 20. They meet in 1889. And he's been studying at the South Kensington School of Art. And he's very great friends with a chap called Henry Mangles, who knows Gertrude Jekyll and has been asking her to design some gardens for him. And so they come together, and she sees him as someone to take under her wing, I think. And he is quite happy to let that happen. As you can see, this little cartoon was drawn by him. And he, at this point, and I'm just going to unshare because I want you to see, at this point, this is the hat that she was wearing when they first met. This is what Gertie looked like when Lutyens first met. A little bit frightening. And yet, to Lutyens, she became Aunt Bumps. And he draws these gorgeous little cartoons of her. And I think only a young man who paid proper attention to this older, stricter lady would have got away with it. I don't know who else got away with calling her Aunt Bumps. But I absolutely love this idea of the two of them. Here's Lutyens a little bit. He's not in his 20s here, he's a little bit older, but you sort of have this vision of the two of them. She would take him out in her little pony cart and point to the architecture and the vernacular buildings of Surrey, and she would tell him about the planting and so on. And together, then they built this dream house. And I'll just show you, because I think if you don't understand the garden, then you don't really, I think, fully understand Jekyll's mindset. I'll just wake it up. There we go. So this is the house he built for her in 1896.
Amazing.
Isn't it gorgeous? He built her a little house called the hut to live in while he built the big Munstead wood. The hut itself is actually not as small as a hut sounds, as you can imagine, but it's very similar in style. And you can see here how he brings the roof lines down, these beautiful deep Surrey rural roof lines down almost into the ground, you know, and you've got the clematis growing up. And these plants would have been grown by, a lot of them, by local nurseries, because Surrey was famous at the time for the range of nurseries, plant nurseries, Goldsworth nurseries, and Jackman's in Woking, and Jackman's being famous for the clematises and so on, and dozens of others around the place. And he creates it. It's angular. It's got the big chimneys, the things that she loves about the vernacular architecture, the tiny windows, but it also has just such deep personality. And around it, he then works with her to create these turning points, these rounds, lots of circles, lots of ironstone from the local quarries and so on, so that it's absolutely rooted in the area. And this is what he and she were always striving with all the gardens that they had, that they worked on. There she is in the heart of the garden. And then these photographs, which were taken by Country Life in about, I think about 1911, are stunning because they show you what she did with the gardens. And they are the absolute. So this is a cool garden with masses of lupins and tulips. This is a garden for late spring. One of the really important things you have to understand about a Gertie garden is you need a lot of space and a lot of money, because she doesn't do a multi-season border. Each border is for one season. So you need to then move to the next part of the garden for the next phase of the flowering. So and this is where, you know, if you try and recreate a Gertie garden at home, this is where you start to sort of, you know, you don't have the massive staff of gardeners, and you don't have probably a big enough garden.
She needed a lot of gardeners to support her in doing this. She did.
It's difficult to tell exactly how many she had, but she had at least half a dozen. And she also, by the 1900s, is running a small nursery, a commercial nursery as well. And we know that because there's a couple of garden catalogues that have survived. But you can see how she's using colour. And she always thanked her artistic training for that she'd had this proper artistic grounding. Here's a real hot border, and you can see again these sort of incredible drifts, the strong reds, and you've got dahlias in there and flags and the geraniums at the front. And you can see as you look at it how there's all those shades of red are similar, but the plant effects are different. And then the great architectural sweep of that silvery whatever it is I'm sorry, I'm very bad at knowing what they all are. And she loved her viewpoints. So again, you've got these angles, and then there'll be a roundel at the end of that path, which will turn you into another direction and so on. And then she loved to play with the plants she'd seen in North Africa. So here you've got these incredible yuccas and that aquilegia, that almost alien form of garden. That would be an early summer garden. The maturity of those plants. That's another thing about Gertie gardens. You need to give them time, because you don't just sort of whack in an aquilegia and it gets that big straight away. And here again is a summer border. I don't know what those yellow bell things are called, but I've got some in my garden and I keep meaning to look them up. So anyone in chat, do tell. So yeah, as I say, and she wasn't afraid of strong colours at all. And the biggest sort of sweep, the famous summer border, would sweep you from the cold right through the heats of reds, yellows, and then back to a cooler garden. And then this is her Michaelmas daisy border, which was famous and was very famous, and was painted by Helen Allingham, and sort of very much set the trend, you know, even in small gardens, for people having a cottage garden. They wanted a Gertie garden, without sort of realizing that actually quite a lot of the cottaginess of it is actually completely manufactured. You know, she's designed it for you. So yeah, so that's her home, and knowing about her garden, I think, is what gives you the key to her, because she increasingly becomes quite detached from people. And this not a photograph at all, this portrait by William Nicholson was painted in 1920 when she's in her late 70s. And I think this is the one that sort of says it all. It was painted at her hearth at home. She was very shy about having a portrait painted because she thought she was unpaintable. She was so concerned about how she looked and just thought she was ugly. And he said, no, you're that's not the point. You're beautiful. I want to paint you. Well, you can't paint me in the daylight because I'll be working. So he got round it by saying, well, can I paint you in the evening when you're resting? So he paints her in her armchair at home in front of the fire by lamplight. And so there she is. And so during the day, in order not to waste the time, he painted a portrait of her boots.
I think those are amazing.
Aren't they gorgeous?
Yes.
Aren't they gorgeous? So yeah, so Gertie, I haven't got very long, so I've tried to sort of wrap around.
So what happened? Yeah. So what happened? You know, to her collections? Where can we see her archives? I know you catalogued a lot of them.
I have. I've had my hands on them, which has been very exciting. Where can you see? Well, this is the thing. I mean, she herself was a great collector, and she was very punctilious, and she labeled things, and she was very organized. But
I can just see that in her face, that she was a very definite lady.
Definite is definitely the word. Yeah. Oh yes. You didn't argue. You never won an argument with Miss Jekyll. I get the impression she would always win the argument somehow. But the difficulty was that I don't think she seemed to think about her legacy, except in deciding what she wanted on her tombstone. So when she died, she said she wanted to have written on her tombstone, artist, gardener, craftswoman.
Interesting. So it's that way round, isn't it?
Yeah. Especially as it sort of went artist, crafts, gardens. But yes, very much so. She was very decided about who she was and what she'd done. But in terms of protecting the documentary legacy, in her lifetime, she gave away 3 collections. One was the collection of artifacts from Old West Surrey that she photographed, all the rural pots and pans and the dog gate and all that. That she gave to Guildford Museum. She gave the photographs that she took for it to the Surrey Photographic Record, which was then held in Croydon as part of a wider county-wide photographic record. And I've forgotten what the third thing was now. Sorry, there was a third thing. But all her garden plans and stuff, they were all in her house when she died. And I think the family, her elder brother died before she did. Herbert died before she did. And I think also her niece, who was closest to her, Pamela McKenna, died in a car crash during the war, or plane crash. The pair of them died very suddenly. So by default, the estate came to her nephew, Francis Jekyll, who was, shall we say, a young gentleman who didn't seem to have much sense of purpose. So his mother encouraged him to write a biography of Miss Jekyll, which he did in 1934. And then allegedly he'd got plans for 2 more books about her, but he never really did them. He'd been a brilliant scholar, and he'd worked briefly at the British Museum, and he'd been a great musician, and he actually collected folk songs for the Folk Songers Society. But he just seems to have sort of dwindled. I think there were lots of very achieving women in the Jekyll line, and the blokes didn't seem to get a look. And so he gave away a lot of there's a rumor that he was even going to put a lot of the garden plans on a bonfire, but they were actually sold at a Red Cross sale and snapped up and taken to Reef Point in the University of California, where they're held. So most of her garden plans are in America. He then sold Munstead Wood in 1947, and there was a massive sale of her effects. So there's a catalogue that lists thousands of photographs, manuscripts, drawings, books, and they were all dispersed. And so when I got my hands on them, they had come back to Surrey archives in a wide variety of ways. The paintings we know they were sold during the sale in 48, and they somehow made their way back to Guildford Library, Local Studies Library, where they were unidentified for quite a long time. And then, as I say, this academic managed to put the pieces together and publish the story in Country Life. And because they belonged to Surrey County Council in the library, then the archive could keep them and they weren't sold. Around the same time as the paintings were discovered, a big folder of her garden plans were discovered. About 45 garden plans were discovered in Hanukkah Park, which was going to be the family home. It was built by Lutyens for the McKennas, but they never lived in it. And it suggested that perhaps Francis Jekyll had looked the plans out for them as they thought they might design their own garden. So we were able to buy those plans with the aid of grants and so on. But other bits have turned up. So the boots here, the painting, I'm going to stop sharing it. So I'll show you a garden plan. Here you go. So this is one of the garden plans. So you can see they're absolutely painful to look at. All those tiny little writing, that's her telling you what to plant where, how many to plant, so you can see what to plant. And so that's one of the ones from Surrey. And she used to write lists in notebooks of the plants she needed and label it for the garden. So you could actually, if you could just about read that terribly tiny handwriting, because they're only little bitty widdy books. These are in Godalming Museum. They were found in a shoebox in the planning office in Waverley Borough Council sometime in the 70s or 80s. So it's like stuff just
it's sort of patching together a life, isn't it? From little scraps that have remained in places.
It is. It's really, I mean, here's some of the photographs. I mean, it is just extraordinary because it's this, she has this incredible legacy. And I think the saddest thing of all, here we go, we've got the portrait and the boots. And they were both offered to the Tate. Along with the actual boots.
Right, yeah.
And the Tate said, no, we don't do portraits. That should go to the National Portrait Gallery. So off she goes to the National Portrait Gallery. The boots are in the Tate, and the boots, the leather boots, were given to an American gardener who took them back. A friend of Miss Jekyll's, Frances, said, you liked her, you have the boots. So she took them back to America. And then in her 80s, she brought them back to Britain and said, look, I think they should be here. So she tried to give them to the Tate to put with the boots. And the Tate said, no, we don't take objects, no. So in the end, she offered them to Hazelmere Museum, and they said, oh, no, Gertie didn't live here. How parochial can you get? So in the end, Guildford Museum, which is the closest to Godalming, has her boots. So it's that thing of a life kind of, she fell out of fashion and it all fell apart, and now it's coming back together again. It's amazing.
Just amazing, Jenny. And I think, it's given a lot of people some insights into Gertrude. That, is much more well-rounded than just the gardens. So thank you so much for that. It's just been fascinating.
You're very welcome.
Fascinating.
I should have said actually that what you were listening to, everybody, as you came in, that was the sound of Munstead Wood. That's the sound of Gertie's garden.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful.
So Caroline, were there some questions?
There were some. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. As you say, there's just so much more to her than I imagined. So I've got a question from Tony and Carol, who say, how could she afford this beautiful house and garden?
She had a private income.
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly how much the private income was, but in common with quite a few of the women that I've studied over the years, where the family had money through trade or engineering or some mysterious way that they got their money. Banking is always a good one. The family were able to support her. She didn't have to work for a living. She did take some money for some commissions, but it was all a little bit infra-dig. You know, I don't need to work. I don't need. So she's an arts and crafts artist who supports the craftsmen, but she doesn't need to work herself. But what happened was that, and that was fine. Throughout the 19th century, inflation's pretty steady. People can live on a reasonable, £100 a year, a very Jane Austen-y kind of thing. But when the First World War came along, it absolutely ruined these annuitants, because inflation just went shot up. And so after the war, she did struggle. She was not as wealthy as she was before. Her money didn't go as far. And also she got a lot less garden commissions because nobody had any gardeners.
Then.
Yeah, nobody had any gardeners anymore. Nobody could afford a garden that big. It was all a bit much. And so she actually became quite big in America, and the American Horticultural Society gave her a gold medal and a cash award in the 1920s, which helped. So that's how it went.
And Joe's asked, were her gardens regarding as cutting edge or even controversial at the time? Were they very new, very different?
I'm not a proper garden historian, so I'm probably going to put my foot in it now. But I think that certainly in the 1870s, they were beginning to be different, because people had become very obsessed with plant collecting and having lots of carpet bedding of one type of plant, and also very formal layouts still. And what she's working for is a very integrated, the landscape and the building, the home, everything. So in a sense, it's sort of Capability Brown, but on a domestic
cottage scale,
except obviously the cottages are gigantic.
Huge, yeah.
but it's a more intimate style of gardening, so it's still quite ostentatious, but not in a very showy way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does, and I think it was it seems like it was very different.
Yeah.
And Jane has said that the plant is a euphorbia. That was
is it? Thank you.
That's what Jane says. So thank you so much. Thank you, Jenny, for bringing all that information. That lovely phrase you used at the very beginning about her being a self-fashioned woman. I really felt that as you talked about her. And thank you, Jane, so much for bringing all of this to all the questions. And it's just flown by. I can't believe it.
I was worried I was going to just rattle on far too much. There's so much you could say. She's quite extraordinary.
And we've had so many participants. It's been absolutely brilliant. I can't tell you. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you again to Neil in the background, who always makes all this happen. But thank you particularly, Jenny and Jane, for giving up your time, preparing.
Pleasure.
So generous with it. I'm really, really grateful.
No worries.
And everybody else will be too. Thank you ever so much.
Okay.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.